Okay, kids, hang on to your hats because it's the last part of the preterite. It's preterite part cinco, the basement boys, or the sandal verbs. Okay, so the basement boy preterites, or the sandal preterites, are also known as stem-changing preterites. And one of the things that's important about the basement boys, or these stem changers, to note is that they're very different from stem changers in the present tense. Present tense stem changers, as you already know, have 5 different kinds of stem changes they make, and they also make those changes in the boot. The preterite ones are a little bit different in a few different ways. The first thing that's different is that in the preterite, AR verbs and ER verbs never, ever touch my drum set. No, just kidding. Never, ever stem change. So verbs that would stem change in the present tense, like cerrar, or poder, or entender, or contar, verbs that you're used to stem changing in the present tense, are not going to stem change in the preterite because the AR verbs and the ER verbs will never, ever stem change in the preterite, which leaves the IR verbs, and the IR verbs do stem change in the preterite. What I have here is a little table, and it shows the differences between stem changing in the present tense and the preterite tense. Now again, this is really just focused on the IR verbs because the AR verbs and the ER verbs are not going to stem change in the preterite. So, in the present tense, if a verb stem changes from E to IE or E to I, because remember, in the present tense, IR verbs can do both. Most IR verbs in the present tense go from E to I, but we do have some exceptions that go E to IE, such as divertirse and sentir and mentir and preferir and so on. In the preterite, it's actually a lot easier, that if you have an IR verb in the preterite and it's a stem changer and you're changing an E, the E is going to go to I always. So that actually makes things a lot easier because you don't have to choose or know the difference between the two. All the E's will always go to an I. In the present tense, we also have verbs that end in IR that go from O to UE, and those same verbs, when we stem change them in the preterite tense, are going to go from O to U. Verbs that are IR ending verbs that are stem changers in the present tense automatically are stem changers in the preterite tense. The E to IEs and the E to Is in the present will go E to I in the preterite. O to UE in the present tense will go O to U in the preterite. So basically, if you have an IR verb and it's a stem changer in the preterite, E's are going to become I's and O's are going to become U's. Some quick examples of some verbs that fall under stem changers in the preterite or basement verbs are the verbs pedir and morir. Just like the present tense, you're still going to continue to change the vowel that's closest to the end, whether being in the ending of the verb, in this case the E in pedir and the O in morir. So again, all E's become I's and all O's become U's. So one difference between present and preterite is that in the preterite, only the IR stem change. And the other difference between stem changers in the present and the preterite is that in the preterite, we don't stem change as many of the forms as we do in the present tense. In the present tense, we stem change in the boot. But in the preterite tense, what we're going to do is we are only going to stem change in the bottom 2 forms. So the top 4 forms are just going to act like normal IR verbs. So it's going to take away the IR and put my endings on. But when we get to the bottom 2, E becomes I, E becomes I. So the reason why these are called basement verbs is if you think of the basement as a house, we're only going to stem change in the basement. So they're the basement boys. They're like the 40-year-olds that are still hanging out in their parents' basement. Okay, they are the basement boys. They're hanging out there, rocking out. most likely to the irregular preterite song or photographia, something along those lines. So if you think of the verb as a house, these are in the basement. These are the basement boys, because there's two of them, and those are the only two that are going to stem change. So it's not a boot verb anymore. It's still a stem changer, but it's not a boot verb anymore. It's a basement verb, the basement boys. Same thing's going to happen here with morir. I'm going to change the O to a U. Only in the bottom two forms. So the top four forms are going to be normal. So bottom two, O to U, O to U. Some people like to call these sandal verbs only because it maintains the idea of this footwear theme that, in the present tense they were boot verbs and now they're sandal verbs. So if you like, you can draw a little sandal there, and we'll give them some. Maybe we'll make it a little flower. Nice drawing on my part. But a lot of people just like this idea of the basement, and you can draw the little house. So whatever works for you. Basement boys or sandal verbs, whatever works. But basically the idea here is that in the preterite tense, we're only going to stem change IR verbs, and we're only going to make those stem changes in the bottom two forms. E's become I's, and O's become U's. The other kind of stem change or basement change that we make in the preterite tense comes with a grouping of verbs that I like to call double vowel infinitives. Double vowel infinitives, or DVIs. And in order for a verb to be classified as a double vowel infinitive, it has to have certain characteristics about it. And those characteristics are that the verb has to have in it two consecutive vowels. The consecutive vowels could be the same vowel, or they could be different. It doesn't matter. That you could have two E's, okay, but you could also have a combination of two other vowels, but two consecutive vowels, meaning they come right next to each other. One of the two vowels has to be in the verb ending, meaning it has to be in the ER or the IR that ends the verb. The other thing is that it has to be an ER verb or an IR verb only. AR verbs are not double vowel infinitives. For instance, a verb like estudiar meets two out of the three requirements. It does have two vowels in a row. One of them is in the ending of the verb, but this is an AR verb. So typical verbs that we run across that are double vowel infinitives would be verbs like leer, two vowels in a row, one's part of the ending of the verb, it's an ER verb, or a verb like oír, that we have two vowels in a row, one's part of the ending of the verb, and it's an IR verb. You have to be careful with certain things, like a verb like traer. Traer certainly meets the requirements of what a double vowel verb is, in that it has two vowels in a row, one's part of the ending of the verb, it's an ER verb. This is not necessarily classified this way in the preterite because traer was already in the irregular preterites, which was part 4. It had a regular stem of traj. So this is a unique verb that kind of does its own separate thing. So double vowel infinitives in Spanish are also basement verbs in the preterite, and they're going to make a stem change that goes from I to Y. I to Y. Now, when you talk about double vowel infinitives making a change from I to Y, one of the questions that typically comes up is, how do you change an I to a Y if the verb itself doesn't actually have an I in it? For instance, leer, two vowels in a row, one's part of the ending of the verb, ends in ER or IR. So how do I change an I in leer if it doesn't actually have an I in it? So you have to do something that I like to call fake conjugate. So what we're going to do with leer is we're going to conjugate it as if it were a normal ER or IR verb. And again, these double vowel infinitives are basement verbs. So what happens is when we get down into the basement here, basement boys, there's a little house. When we get down to the basement, what we're going to do now is we're going to make this stem change. We're going to go from I to Y. So literally what we're going to do is we're going to take this I and we're going to make it a Y. I becomes Y. I becomes Y. So the I is not in here anymore. It's gone. The I has become the Y. So this is your L form. This is your Eos form. Leyó, leyeron. The I is gone. The I has become the Y. Another verb would be a verb like oír. Again, your top forms are going to be like normal verbs. And if you fake conjugate the whole thing, you're going to get something that looks like this. And again, it's a basement verb. It's our little house. And what we want to do is we want to literally make the I into a Y. So my L form is going to be oyó, and my Eos form is going to be oyeron. The only additional piece of information that comes up and can sometimes be confusing is that once in a while you're going to run across a verb that is a stem changer, and it's also a double vowel verb at the same time. So the question is, do I make the stem change, for instance, E to I, or do I do the double vowel change, I to Y, or do I do both of those things? And the answer is that when we run across verbs that are both stem changers and double vowel verbs at the same time, you're going to make the stem change, in other words, change it from E to I or O to U, and you're going to ignore the double vowel part. So these particular verbs should not have any Y's in them. A couple examples of this would be a verb like reír. As you can see, reír, which is a known stem changer, the E going to an I, also is a double vowel verb. It has the two vowels in a row. One's part of the ending of the verb, and then it's an IR verb. Another example would be the verb seguir. Again, a known stem changer. E goes to I. But this one has a double vowel quality to it as well. We have two consecutive vowels. One's in the end of the verb. It ends in IR. So when that happens, what you want to do is you're going to do the stem change, and you are not going to do the double vowel change. So, for instance, if we were looking at reír, again, the top four forms are going to be normal because we're only making changes in the basement here. But when we get to the basement, this E is going to become an I. So we have real. And same thing here. There should not be any Y's in this. So we're going to do the stem change, ignore the double vowel part. So this is not part of it. We are going to do the stem change. So.
Please. Can I pull my alarm?
Just like this video.
Can I please pull it?